Hello and welcome to another part of how MusiKraken works. This time I will talk about the chord splitter. The chord splitter splits incoming chords into separate notes, sorts these by pitch and, for example, sends the highest note out to channel 1, the second highest note out to channel 2 and so on. So here you can see channel 1 will be sent to a trumpet in this example, channel 2 will be sent to a synthesizer and channel 3 to a flute. So if I show this here, I play a note. And if I only play one note, it will be sent out to channel 1 to the trumpet. But if I play two notes, the second note will be sent to the synthesizer out to channel 2. And if I play three notes, it will also send notes to the flute. This way you can control multiple instruments simultaneously. In the settings, you can change the starting channel and set if the notes should be distributed from the highest to the lowest or the other way around. In this example, I used audio units on an iPad. I will later show you how you can set this up to use it with a computer. Here I have connected three instruments to the first three output channel ports. I use completely different instruments so that you can hopefully hear the difference better, but usually you would use instruments that sound better together or even multiple times the same instrument. By default, the chord splitter is set to legato mode. Each of these instruments that I loaded in this demonstration is a legato or a mono instrument. This means that it only plays one voice simultaneously, and if the notes overlap, it will create nice transitions. So if I, for example, connect the MIDI out port of the keyboard directly with the swam trumpet and play overlapping notes, it will create nice transitions. So if I remove the connection here and connect it directly to the swam trumpet, I can play nice transitions. The downside of this is that I cannot play multiple trumpets simultaneously. So if I play a chord, it will only play one voice. But with the chord splitter, I can control multiple trumpets or any legato instruments simultaneously. This is just one use case of the chord splitter, but this is what it does with the default settings. The chord splitter doesn't care where the chord comes from. It could be from the keyboard, or I could also create a chords pad, for example, connect it here, and then it will also work, or anything that sends chords. But by using the chord splitter in combination with the keyboard, you can get something special, per note control. If you know MusiKraken already, you know that you can connect a green value port, one of these for example, to an orange MIDI input port. So for example, I can connect a Y slide port with the MIDI input of the chord splitter, like this. This will create a new value to MIDI converter module, and by default this will control modulation, like CC1. So now if I slide on the key, up and down, it will control modulation. The keyboard not only sends these finger sliding events per keyboard, there's one value that is sent per keyboard, but it simultaneously sends one value per note. So if I do this, for example, I hope you could hear the difference. You can send modulation independently per note this way, so you get per note control. This way you can do the same thing that an MPE instrument or soon MIDI 2.0 instruments would do, but with instruments that do not support MPE or MIDI 2. You can use any normal instrument, load it multiple times, connect it to separate channels of the chord splitter, and you can control anything from modulation, expression, pitch bend, whatever the instrument supports per note. It doesn't have to be a legato instrument, you can use whatever you want. And these ports all send per note events, so sidewise sliding is per note, upward sliding is per note, and finger radius is per note. The keyboard sends out both a general value for the current slide position that is the same for the whole keyboard, and also separate values for each key that the user slides on. All of these are routed through the nodes of MusiKraken, like these connections here, until one module decides to use one or the other of these, so either a general value or separate values for each node. And the Chord Splitter is one of these modules. Currently it's the only module that does that, but there will be more. The Chord Splitter by default selects the per note values if there are any. You can change this in the settings if you want. It really depends on what you want to do. Sometimes it is better to send the same value out to all instruments than having separate values per note. The only internal module that will send per note events is the keyboard currently, because each finger will play a separate note anyways. Maybe I will also add this to the chords pad in the future, but as two notes could play the same note there, I'm not really sure yet how I will solve this. But there is one other way to generate per note events. You can connect an external MIDI keyboard to your device. So if I get rid of this, create the MIDI input module, then scan for Bluetooth devices, connect in this case to a Lumi keys block, and then select it here. Then I will activate the MPE mode. Now all per note events that the MPE keyboard sends will be filtered out and converted to the internal system. And similar to the internal keyboard, this will also generate a per keyboard event as well. So you can still choose to either use these per note values or use the same value for the whole keyboard. This is the Lumi keyboard by Rolly. It supports MPE per note pressure, so I can connect the pressure port here. It is set to control different modulations again as before. And now if I play a note and press it, you can hear the modulation changes and it still works per note. So it has the same effect as when using the internal keyboard. To demonstrate how the per note values work, I created a simple value viewer module this morning. It simply displays the current value that is sent out of a value port. So you can simply connect it to any value port and then it will show the value here. So as I explained before, the keyboard sends out one global value when I slide. So as you can see here, I directly connected the value viewer to the Y slide port. So when I slide, it changes the value. And as you can see, the normal sliding works like a normal slider, like the mod wheel on the keyboard. When I release it, the value stays, it doesn't jump back or anything. So I can simply play and slide a bit more up and down. The speed of this value change can be defined in the settings. So there is a sensitivity setting here. I can set this down, and now when I slide, the value changes a bit slower. As I mentioned before, this is a global value that is sent per keyboard. So if I play a chord, there will also be only one value. And at the same time, per note values are sent, as I will demonstrate later. I can change this behavior if I want. So I can, for example, say that it should reset the Y value when the touch ends. So in this case, jumps back to a predefined value, and the predefined value can also be set. This is here. And as you can see, it jumps back as soon as the last touch ends. I personally really like the way this works, as it stays in the value. I can play and continue from this value when playing. But this doesn't work with per note values, because I don't know when I change the note which one is supposed to be responsible for this value and which one for the other one. So I had to do something differently, and I will show you now how. The setup to demonstrate this looks a bit more complicated. I've created a chord splitter. I connected it to the keyboard. I connected a value to MIDI converter here to the Y slide port and to the MIDI in of the chord splitter, so that the values are split, and set this to modulation. And to show the value, I've created a MIDI to value converter for each of these so that I can filter out the values again and show it. So here you can see the values for channel 1, the values that are sent out of channel 2 and the values on channel 3. And if I play a chord, you can see that these have different values, so they change independently. They send per note values. And how these per note values are generated in the keyboard can be set in the settings of the keyboard. And here there are different settings for the sideways and upwards sliding. By default, the upward sliding is set to absolute highest value on the top. There is also absolute highest value at bottom, and there is a relative setting. So default setting, you can see here at the top there is 1, at the bottom there is 0. So it really depends where I touch on the key. This way you can easily control different values by just moving your finger there on the key. The opposite is the absolute highest value at the bottom, in which case down here is 1 and up here is 0. But then there is also the relative setting. And the relative setting works similarly to the reset Y value when touch ends. And it's also affected by this reset value. So it doesn't matter where I touch. The value will be set to the reset value. And then when I slide, it goes from there. So if I touch here, it will go to reset value, which is now 0.45, and go from there. And also here. And this works for all keys. And this sliding speed is also affected, as I shown before, by this sensitivity setting. So try out these different settings and find out which ones work best for you. When playing chords, there will be a short delay before the notes are sent to the instruments. The reason for this is that you will probably not play all the notes of a chord exactly at the same time, but shortly one after the other. Except maybe if you are a robot. But humans are usually not that perfect. So the chord splitter needs to wait until it can assume that all the notes of the target chord are pressed and all the no longer necessary notes were released. MusiKraken uses two different delays for this, and both can be set separately and adjusted to how fast you are. By default, the chord splitter assumes that the number of notes of the next chord does not change. So if you play a 3-note chord, it assumes that the next chord will also have 3 notes. So if you press down 3 notes, it will wait until the shorter delay of the 2 has run out and then send these 3 notes out. But if after that short delay you have 4 or 2 keys pressed down, the longer delay will take effect. The reason why it works this way is that when transitioning from one chord to a new one, you will usually shortly have only 2 notes down because one finger moves from one key to another. So. Or maybe 4 keys instead of 3 target keys. So the chord splitter doesn't know yet if the target chord was reached. It could even be that you, for just a short time, press different 3 keys down during the transition. That is why it also needs a short delay, even if it knew the number of notes of the next chord. But usually the number of notes will be different during the transition, so that is why there are 2 different delays. But you can still play chords with different number of notes this way, but the delay will be a bit longer. If you release the notes again before the delay runs out, it will quickly play them, because then the chord splitter also knows which notes were pressed. This way you can play short notes. If you look at the chord splitter in the editor, it has one MIDI input port. Any collection of MIDI notes sent into here will be distributed to the output channels. MIDI supports up to 16 channels per connection, and each channel has its own output port here, so that you can connect directly and define what should happen with the notes sent out of this channel. But there is also a MIDI out port that sends all notes out, and the notes will already be assigned to the correct channel. So for simple setups, you can also use this. Let's have a look at the settings that this module has. The start channel defines with which channel the distribution of the notes should start. By default, the highest note is sent to channel 1, but if you, for example, want to start at channel 3 instead, you can change this here. I usually leave this on channel 1 and change the channels later using the channel switcher module, but you can do it all here if you want. Then next there is the start with the highest note setting. By default, it will send the highest note to channel 1, the next lower one to channel 2 and so on. But you can turn this around. If you disable this, the lowest note will be sent to channel 1 instead, and the next higher one to channel 2 and so on. Next is activate delay. If you want to distribute the notes correctly, so for example send the highest note always on channel 1, you will need some delay. But if you do not care which of the notes is sent out on which channel, you can also deactivate the delay. The best example use case for this is probably if you want to create a fake MPE instrument. In this case, I would load the same instrument on multiple channels. This doesn't work very well with legato instruments, so use normal polyphonic instruments for this. Now, as described earlier, I can send any per note events to the chord splitter and it will distribute it to the correct channel. Because I used the same instrument multiple times, I do not care about which channel which note is sent to. All I care about is that the per note events are also sent to the correct instrument. So now I will have a typical MPE-like playing experience with per note control of each voice without using any MPE instrument. And here are the two delay settings. As described before, the chord detection delay will control the duration of the delay that will be applied when switching, for example, from a 2-note chord to a 3-note chord. It is the longer delay of the two. And the minimal detection delay will be applied when switching from a chord to another chord with the same number of notes. So experiment with those two settings to find the ideal combination for your playing style. The delays really depend on how quickly you switch from one chord to the other. And then there is the legato setting. When this is enabled, it will generate some overlap of the notes on each channel. Most legato instruments depend on overlapping notes to play nice transitions. But if you do not use legato instruments, then turn this off. And use per note events when available. Instead of using the per note events from the keyboard, you can also use the global keyboard events that are sent simultaneously. For example, while sliding on the keyboard, the Y port sends both per note events and one event for the whole keyboard. If you disable this setting, it will use the same value for each channel. This really depends on what you want to do. When, for example, controlling a full virtual orchestra, you might not want to have per note control, so you can disable this. MPE mode. This setting will probably be removed in the future because I now moved this setting to the MIDI input module instead. This can be used to define that the input signal is an MPE controller, so it knows that the events should be distributed per channel. But when converting the MPE events inside the MIDI input module already, you get far better control over this. And finally, there is switch channels of active notes. Usually, if I keep playing a note and change the other notes, the note that is still active could switch the channel. So for example, if I play a note, the second one, this will be channel 1 here, and this one channel 2. But if I switch, suddenly this one is channel 1 and this one is channel 2, so it changes the channels. And I can deactivate this if I want. So if I deactivate this, it will not switch. But this can have the side effect of using more channels that are assigned if you play slower than the delay. Maybe there will be a setting for the maximum number of channels in the future to make this better. Try this out to see if it works for you. I personally prefer to have this disabled. So far I used audio units to demonstrate this, but you can of course also use this as a MIDI controller together with a DAW on a computer. So here is an example of how I can connect the iPad to send MIDI to a Mac. This is just one of the possible combinations. You can also connect Android devices to Macs, or connect via Bluetooth, or connect the iPad to Windows and so on. I just show this to demonstrate one possibility. So in the computer I open up Applications, go to Utilities, and then Audio MIDI Setup. And here it shows my iPad, which is connected by cable to this computer. So if I click Enable, it will enable inter-device audio and MIDI short IDEM, so that I can send MIDI events from the iPad to the computer using the USB cable. On the iPad, first maybe get rid of everything, new project. Then I will create a keyboard. I will create a chord splitter. And I will create as output a MIDI output. And the MIDI output I can select IDEM now. So select it. Now connect everything up. And this should already send MIDI events out to the computer. It will play on the keyboard. So maybe make this smaller. And on the computer I opened up Logic. You can use any other DAW for this as well. The process should be similar. Now I've loaded 3 times the same instrument in 3 different tracks. I used 8DO libraries, for example, here, and if I play it on the keyboard, it sounds like this, but now it only sends it to the active channel. So, first of all, I open up these track settings and, well, select the first track and set it to filter out all events except the ones sent to channel 1. Then I do the same thing for track 2 and set it to channel 2, and the same thing for channel 3 and filter out all events that are not sent to channel 3. So now I also need to select these so that all tracks are active. And now if I play on the keyboard, even though there are legato instruments, I can control 3 of them simultaneously. I can also combine this with per note events if I want. So again, connect to this Y slide, make it modulation. And now I can slide on the keys. And the events are sent separately to the different channels. So here in this example I used the MIDI out port, but I could also have used the separate ports for this as well. So this is just an example of how you can use this. You can create all kinds of combinations using this technique. And you can use any kind of instrument with this. For example, I now switched all 3 to use Joshua Bell's violin VST. Again, they don't have to be a legato instrument. You can use any kind of instrument you want. You can also combine the chord splitter with other modules to create more complex setups. I now will create a channel switcher to make setting this up easier. So go here, Effects, Channel Switcher. With the channel switcher, I can create all kinds of combinations and then in the end reassign them to specific channels before sending it to the computer. So I delete this connection here, set it to MIDI out, and now anything can be routed to different channels. On the computer, I will now create a strings setup. So on the first channel, I will load violins. And on the second channel, violas. On the third channel, cellos. And I create a 4th channel that will load basses. And assign this again to channel 4. All the other ones are still assigned. There are multiple ways to combine these. I will start by simply sending the topmost note to the violins. So I connect the output of the chord splitter on channel 1 to the channel 1 port of the channel switcher, these two. As this is already assigned to channel 1 and I do not change anything, I could also just have connected it directly. But once I have everything connected, it will look better this way. Instead of sending the second note directly to the violas, maybe I should create a transposer to transpose this down by 1 octave. So here's the transposer, set it to -1 and connect this. Now let's do the same thing for the cellos. Effects, transposer, but 2 octaves down. I can zoom out so I can see everything. Maybe I should just use 3-note chords for this example, but you can of course change that however you want. So I will create another transposer. I here also set it to -2, but I will reuse the notes that are sent to the 3rd channel and send them here to the 4th channel, to the basses. So now the whole string section should play for me. And again I can slide per note if I want that. And this way you can create all kinds of complex setups. Now I've loaded trumpets, horns and trombones, trumpets on channel 5, horns on channel 6 and trombones on channel 7. I created a separate chord splitter for this. You don't have to, you can reuse the other one, but for demonstration purposes this is easier. And I have transposed the trumpets down by 1 octave, the horns by 2 and the trombones by 3. Now if I connect to the Y slide again, we'll create a modulation value to MIDI converter again, and now if I play, it will control both the strings and the brasses. Instead of using the sliding, I can use anything else. For example, I could use my face to control the modulation of these. So I can go here, create the ARKit face tracking, remove this one, and then mouth open, maybe show the camera. In this example, the strings are still controlled by sliding on the keys and the brass is controlled with my mouth. To make mouth control easier, I would change the input range a bit so that it doesn't react immediately when I open the mouth, and also that I don't have to fully open the mouth to get the full value. But for this demonstration I will remove the face tracking again because it is a bit annoying having the camera up here. And attach this again. To make this setup more interesting, I could add more things, for example an arpeggiator. I now have loaded a marimba on channel 8. I've created an arpeggiator and transpose it down by 1 octave. So when I play, we'll also trigger the arpeggiator so I can make this rhythm a bit more interesting, maybe, I don't know. Let's try this out. Probably not the best example, but it works for this demonstration. I could add another arpeggiator. I now have created another arpeggiator and created a different setup and loaded strings, so if I play it now, and so on. You can create whatever you want and make this even more complicated if you want. I hope you now have a basic understanding of what the chord splitter does, and see you in the next video.